This video is brought to you by LogRocket, the front-end performance monitor that records videos of user sessions along with logs and network data, surfacing problems and revealing the root cause of every bug. Try it today at logrocket.com/YT.
Hey, it's Lee Halliday, and controlling the flow of your React application is crucial to getting the result that you're looking for. Here I've got a tweet that I've built, and there are a number of things we could change, sort of controlling what's displayed. For example, what if there were no comments? We maybe wouldn't show this section at all. This show hide should show or hide the comments. And there's 9 ways we're going to cover to control whether something is rendered or not. So Esteban Herrera wrote a great article on the LogRocket blog about 8 conditional rendering methods. He actually touches on more than 8 things, which is why we're going to cover these 9 things that I've entered as comments into my tweet. So we're going to cover if else, how to return null when you don't want to render anything, how to store some JSX in a variable so that you can control whether something's displayed using that, using ternaries, using short circuit to decide whether something is displayed or not, covering IIFEs, immediately invoked function expressions, using sub-components to clean up our code, and then creating our own if components and then higher order components to control maybe we only show something when the user is authenticated. So let's get started. I've got the code here that was displaying that tweet we were just looking at. It's a very simple Create React app with nothing installed in it except what comes with Create React app. And just to give a quick overview of what we're looking at, we're importing React, some CSS that I created to get it to look like this. And then we've got a hard-coded array of comments. So these are the subjects we're going to cover over the next 10 to 15 minutes. If we come down here, we've got sort of the main component that's rendering it out, this tweet. It's inside of a div. Then we've got the tweet header, the tweet body, which are this component and this component. We're not going to look at those at all. Where we're going to focus are the tweet comments. So tweet comments is receiving as a prop this array of comments. And we'll just sneak down here to the bottom. And this is where we're going to be looking at all these concepts. So the first thing we wanted to cover was it's a simple if or else statement. So imagine we want to control if there's no comments, there's no point in showing any of this code at all, right? So we'll start with an if statement. So if comments.length is 0, then we're going to return one thing. So we'll just say no comments, sorry. Else, we'll take this whole return statement and place it in the else. Just like that. So I do have comments, but let's go back and trick it. So let's pass you an empty array of comments. So now you can see that it's displaying no comments, sorry. If we were to come back and pass the comments again, we're back. So first concept, just using if and else to return entire chunks of JSX from a component. Now, let's say we wanted to not say no comments, sorry, but just to simply have nothing at all. Well, the second concept is you can return null from a component, and like null sort of suggests, nothing will be rendered. So we can do that if we go back and pass our empty array like that. Now we've got nothing rendered at all. Now I think, oops, there we go. Let's just get back to where we were. Cool. So I think we can actually clean this code up. Instead of having it formatted like this, the one thing we can do is we can actually get rid of this else statement like that, and maybe add an extra space here. And I like this approach of sort of, I call them guard clauses basically. They're clauses at the top of your component where you're checking some sort of clause, some conditional, and you're just getting out of there as soon as possible so that if you get beyond this if statement, you know that in this case we've got comments, so we don't have to check for that anymore. We've sort of already had the guard clause at the top. And in my opinion, it's a little bit cleaner. So we've covered how to return null when you want to render nothing. The next thing is element variables. Store JSX in a variable. So this is just going to be a quick little example, but imagine you're building a form and there could be errors or there might not be errors. What you can do is you can create a variable called, say, error, and you can initialize it to null. And then if some condition is true, let's just say if true in this case, because we're just showing how it works, we want to set this to something else. So let's set it to JSX. So we could do maybe a span with a class name of error. I don't have that set up, so why don't we go do that quickly? Just add a .error. We'll set the color to a nice red there, so whenever that happens. There was an error, please fix. Cool. So let error, perfect. So error either has null in it, or if some condition is true, we've put in it some JSX, and now we can embed this variable inside of the thing that we're returning from our component. So if we come back here, we see there was an error, please fix. If this condition was false for whatever reason, then we have nothing being displayed because null, error contained null. So that's the third way. I think it was 3 anyways, yeah. Is basically you can use a variable that has null or some JSX in it to conditionally render something. So that was just an example. It doesn't really have too much to do with our tweet example, so let's keep going. So the fourth way is ternaries. So take your if statements inline. So inside of JSX, you cannot just embed if statements. So you can't say if something, it's invalid JSX. The only sort of way to get that sort of if-else logic inside of your JSX directly is with a ternary. So a ternary has two sides to it. It's some condition, question mark, then the truthy side and the falsy side, like that. So what we're going to do is rig up our button to show and hide with some state so we can actually click it to show and hide these comments. So we'll come up to the top and we will create some state. So we'll say whether we want to show it or not, and we'll have a function to set that show. And this will be the useState hook, which will begin as, why don't we say true? Cool. So ternary, we've got our condition first, so we're going to look at the show variable. Then we have our question mark. So if that's true, we want to show all of this JSX here. And if it's false, we will display nothing. So we'll put null. I'll hit save and Prettier will clean up my code. And that's the ternary. So it's showing right now. If I were to set its default value to false, it wouldn't show. Why don't we make it so that the button actually works? So on click, what we'll do is call set show to be the opposite of whatever it currently is. And we can even clean this up with a ternary as well. So we'll say if it's show, we want to do the opposite when you click the button. So that would mean we want to hide. And if it's false, that would mean we want to show. Just like that. So if we want to hide these, show them, hide them, show them, perfect. So we used two ternary statements, the condition, the truthy side, and the falsy side. And we also used that just with a string, not really with JSX. So that's the fourth way. The fifth way is sort of a short form version of that. When you don't really want to show anything in the false side, we can do what's called a short circuit operator. So the way a lot of programming languages work is if you have a condition, two conditions with an and between them, so first condition and second condition, if the first one is false, it won't even try to execute the second one. If it is true, it will go and execute the second one, check the second one. And we can sort of use that in the way JavaScript works to basically get rid of the ternary and avoid having to say or null here. So we'll say if show and. So if this is truthy, keep going. And because it sort of returns whatever the second half of this conditional is, we can get rid of this. And this is a short way to show something when it's true. So if show and then the second half of that short circuit operator. And this should still work the same as it did before. Now, there is one caveat with this in that if show happens to be false, that's sort of what gets returned from this JSX expression here. And in React sort of DOM in the web, that's fine. But in React Native, it doesn't like it when you return the false value. It sort of freaks out a little bit. So I would recommend, even though it's a few more characters, to just stick with the ternary and be explicit about what your false on the conditional is returning, because that will work in both React DOM and React Native. The next conditional we are going to look at is the IIFE, the immediately invoked function expression. Why don't we fix that invoked? Ain't nobody got time for that. Invoked. So what is that? That's basically a way, and we're going to be getting rid of this just to show how it works. Because of the way in JSX you can sort of embed any sort of expression that JavaScript has that returns a value, what we could actually do is invoke or embed a function like this. So end of the function, end of the expression. We're going to wrap the function in parentheses and then call that function immediately. So we would need to return from our function. And you can already see it's sort of ugly, and I wouldn't recommend taking this approach, because I think if you get to this point, for whatever reason, ternary doesn't work, it's probably better to look at another approach that we're going to do, where you actually remove all the complexity and move it into a subcomponent. But anyways, just to show how it works, inside of this function, it basically gets executed immediately, hence the name immediately invoked function expression. What we could do is we could say if not show, return null, and sort of else if it gets here, return this. So this is another way to conditionally control whether we are showing these comments. I'm going to undo a bunch to basically get us back to where we were before. Hopefully that's not too confusing. There we go. So we're back to the ternary approach because I prefer it over that IIFE. And the next thing I want to show is using subcomponents when appropriate. If you start to add all sorts of conditional logic, you can see it starts to sort of get harder to read what's happening. And in my opinion, it can get cleaned up if we were to basically take this chunk and move it into its own component. So I'm going to create a new component here, and we'll call it the tweet list, we'll say. So this receives the comments, and we'll do a sort of an auto-returning function. And as soon as I fix this code up here to show the tweet list, passing in the comments, there we go, formats the code. So you can see now it's a little bit easier. It's still the same logic, the same ternary conditional, but if show, we render out the tweet list, else nothing. And now this code is a little bit cleaned up, and we have a smaller component here, a subcomponent, that is only in charge of rendering out the list. It has no logic in it. It's just showing the comments that are passed to it. Just to confirm it's still working, we can do that. Cool. So there's a couple other approaches you can take to conditionally showing something. The first one I'm going to show is something that Esteban shows in this article, and it's basically an if component. And in my opinion, it reminds me a little bit when you're using something like React Router and you've got a path, and if the path matches, you're going to show another component. So we're going to create our own sort of mini version of that. So what we're going to do is create a component called if with a big I there. And it's going to be a functional component. So what this is going to receive is basically just one thing. Well, sorry, I lied. Two things. The conditional and the children. So child components passed to if. So what we're going to do is we're going to say if conditional. So if the conditional is true, let's return the children. Else, or sort of below this if statement, we are just going to return null. So now we can use this if component right here. So we can say if conditional. So in our case, it's this show variable. So if that's true, render out the children. So we're going to pass the tweet list as children. Just like that. So it still works, and just to explain it a little bit better, we've created our own component called if. It receives two things, a prop called conditional, which is a Boolean true or false, and some children nested inside. So this mini component, its only job is basically, if the conditional is true, to return the children so they get rendered out. Else or otherwise, it's going to return nothing at all. So that's a little way if you prefer this sort of logic. You could also go a step further. You could to almost treat it more like a route component in React Router. You could pass in a component to render out like this and make if self-closing. So if conditional, here's the component to render out. So we would come up here then and we would change from children, it would be the component. And it should function the same. Cool. So now it's very much like a router. Imagine you have a route with a path, say the home path. So if that path matches, if it's true, here's the component to render out. Anyways, that's just a little way you can conditionally show something. The last approach we're going to look at is a high order component. And that's basically a function that you wrap around another component. So you can embed some logic in that high order component that can be reused across sort of multiple other components. If that's confusing, why don't we actually look at the example? So what we're going to do is we're going to create a high order component, or in other words, just a function called withAuth. So it's an arrow function for now. So what does this function receive? It's going to receive some other component. So imagine this entire thing like that. So we're going to pass this in, and we'll just do a big C because of the way we want to render it out that you'll see in a second. Cool. And because of the way React works, functional components, they should be functions that you can call, right? So when we wrap this withAuth around another component, like we'll do in a second, what we want to do is have this high order component return, in a sense, a component that can be rendered. Why don't we just look at it, because I don't know if I explained it the best. So first things first, let's wrap this around. So withAuth, wrap that whole thing around like that, spell it right. Cool. And now we can add some logic in to basically decide, are we going to render the component that was passed in to this, or are we going to render something else? So what are we going to check for? Because we're looking for authentication, why don't we just look if there's a user in local storage? So local storage, if local storage dot get item, we'll do the user string, the user key. So if that's true, we are going to return a function that will receive props and render out the component that was passed to this high order component. So these props are the ones that React typically passes to your component when it's called. So in our case, it's the comments that the tweet comments component is receiving. So what we can do is use the spread operator to spread these props out so they get passed, in our case, to the tweet comments function or component. So else, and we don't need the else because if the truth part returns, we would never get here anyway, so I typically avoid the else in that case, but we're going to return a span that says you must be authenticated, like that. Okay, let's try this out. Oh boy, what did I do? All right, let's try to troubleshoot this. So, what did we pass to with auth? We passed this entire oh, I know. Our high order component always has to return a function that can be called. So what we missed is that we need to return a function that React will try to render, it will try to call. There we go. So because I have nothing in local storage, it's showing this you must be authenticated. So we're going to sneak into the console and we are going to add a key to local storage. So set item user, it will have a value of Lee, like that. So now if we refresh the page, now our with auth high order component, it checks local storage, it finds that there's a user, and it renders the comments. Just like that. It works. So if we were to come back and local storage, remove item, remove that user, like that. Refresh, we're back to you must be authenticated. Cool, so now that we've got that done, why don't we just rehash what we did with the high order component? Because frankly, I find them a little bit confusing. But it is an option, and the cool thing is we could wrap with auth around any other component that we want a user to be authenticated in order to see that content. So high order component, what it does is it's a function that receives a component, and its job is basically to return another function that will be called by React. So it'll be rendered. So whenever React is trying to render a functional component, it calls it and it passes in the props. And in our case, we're passing those props down to the component that was passed in, spreading them out. So if we come down and look at how it was used, we've wrapped with auth around our tweet comments functional component, and it's receiving comments that were passed through props and then spread out so that we can receive them here inside of our tweet comments. Cool, so that was 9 ways to conditionally render or control the flow inside of your React application. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. Take care. Bye.